In 732 AD, Umayyad forces crossing the Pyrenees from Al-Andalus to Gaul pushed all the way to modern-day central France. But somewhere in between the cities of Tours and Poitiers, they were met by the Frankish forces of Charles the Hammer Martel. A battle took place which would go on to be remembered as one of the most important of all time. Before we get started, I want to tell you that I'm going to be publishing ebooks soon. Also, I do a free newsletter, so if you're interested in either of those, there's a link through which you can provide your email address in the bio to this video. The first century after the birth of Islam saw the rapid expansion of this new civilization. Under the Umayyad Caliphate, the empire of Islam sprawled across 3 continents. In the east, it was pushing into Central Asia, whilst in the west, the Umayyad Berber general Tariq ibn Ziyad had crossed over from Morocco to Spain in 711, and by 718 controlled almost all of Iberia. Not content with this, the Muslims began pushing beyond the Pyrenees into modern-day France. There they were defeated in 721 at the Battle of Toulouse, but that had not forced the Muslims to abandon their ambitions of conquest, and they went on to secure some important cities in southern France. After setting up base in Narbonne, a port city in the south, the Umayyads were well established to make raids into what was the former Roman colony of Gaul and modern-day France. In the meantime, Otto of Aquitaine, who was actually the man to defeat the Muslims' aforementioned first incursion into France in 721, had made an alliance with an independent Muslim Berber leader of Catalonia, who was not fond of the central Umayyad government in Cordoba. The Umayyads subsequently sent an expedition to neutralize the rebellious Muslim leader of Catalonia. After that was achieved, the Umayyads went after his ally across the Pyrenees, which was of course Otto of Aquitaine. And so it was in 732 that the Umayyads, under the leadership of Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the governor of Al-Andalus, made their most alarmingly successful attack when they were able to push all the way to central France. Otto decided to make a stand at Bordeaux, probably feeling confident considering his prior victories over the Umayyads. But he was sorely disappointed because he lost. The city of Bordeaux was subsequently sacked, and Otto had no option but to ask for help from his biggest rival, Charles Martel. It should be mentioned that at this time France was a divided realm. The Merovingian dynasty, which once held all of this territory, had become a shadow of its former self. Charles Martel may not have been king, but he was the power behind the throne, the de facto ruler, if you'd like, of much of northern and central France. Charles had a very busy life, constantly on the offensive to bring more and more of modern-day France and Germany under Frankish authority. In fact, you can say his industriousness was passed on to his son Pepin and grandson Charlemagne, the man who would go on to rule much of Europe. So when Otto of Aquitaine approached him for help, Charles made sure to achieve some sort of a strategic advantage from it by offering his help only with the condition that Otto submit to Frankish authority. Before we get into the actual battle, a quick note about the battle's name. The two armies actually met in between Tours and Poitiers in central France. And this helps to explain the confusion of the name ascribed to the battle in English, with some also knowing it as the Battle of Poitiers, but that was also the name of a key battle between the French and the English in the 14th century during the 100 Years' War, so I used Tours to avoid that confusion. In terms of the numbers on both sides, they have been grossly exaggerated, which is understandable considering the significance of the battle's result. But modern conservative estimates, based on what the land could support, were around 25,000 for the Muslims and around 20,000 for the Franks. But one thing is certain, Charles Martel had strategically gained the upper hand for a few reasons. Firstly, Charles had pivotally marched his forces by avoiding the main roads. So when he appeared before the Muslims who were on their way to plunder the rich town of Tours, Charles had achieved the strategic surprise he had sought. Secondly, Charles assumed the higher ground by stationing his troops on top of a hill that had trees in front to slow down the imminent frontal assault of the Umayyad cavalry. the trees also had the added incentive of hiding or screening the true size of Charles's force. This meant that Charles had dictated where the battle was going to take place and how it would be fought. Now, Abdul Rahman, the leader of the Umayyads, was no simpleton. He likely understood that he had been outmaneuvered by a foe it seems he wasn't prepared for. From his lack of preparation for the eventual battle with Charles's Frankish forces, it seems Abdul Rahman either underestimated or was unaware of Charles's existence as a potential threat. For 7 days, the two forces fought minor skirmishes, but Charles Martel knew if he was going to make his high ground advantage tell, he had to hold his ground and not come down from the hills, which is exactly what the Muslims were waiting for. Perhaps worried by the onset of winter and drawn by the allure of Tours' booty, Abdul Rahman finally ordered a full frontal assault on the 7th day, fully trusting his cavalry. Despite not having the higher ground, this wasn't such a bad decision, but what proved to be the difference was the caliber of the forces the Umayyads were going up against. Charles had organized his forces into a phalanx formation, whereby his troops assumed a rectangular shape and was made up mostly of heavy infantry, many of whom were battle-hardened veterans that had fought for Charles for a number of years in his numerous other campaigns. Typically, in a contest between a cavalry charge and heavy infantry, you would put your money on the cavalry to come up on top. But Charles's forces were disciplined through years of active service and stood their ground. The decisive moment came when the Umayyad forces reacted to the news of Frankish scouts raiding their camp down below. This may have been a rumour started by the Franks, but regardless, this was a problem, since the Muslims had brought along all the loot they had gained throughout their campaign. When some of them turned to return to their camp and secure the loot, other Umayyad soldiers viewed this as a retreat, perhaps signalling that the battle wasn't going so well for them in the first place if they wanted a way out anyway. Inevitably, this led to anarchy amongst the Muslim forces. Abdul Rahman tried to stop the retreat, but he was surrounded and killed by the Franks. Just to highlight the discipline of the Franks, Charles Martel's forces did not pursue the Umayyads when they put them to flight because they believed the battle would resume the next morning. So, they just resumed their formation and rested for the night, unaware that without their leader, the Umayyads had no interest in continuing the fight there and then, and so they stealthily retreated in the direction of their southern holdings in France during the night. The next morning, the Franks expecting battle were surprised, and after extensive reconnaissance, discovered that their Muslim foes were long gone with whatever loot they could carry. In the aftermath, Charles Martel would become the leading power in France. Even if he wasn't the king, he still laid the foundation for the Carolingian dynasty, which was to be founded by his son Pepin and taken to its heights by his grandson Charlemagne. As for the Umayyads, they did not view this battle as the death blow to their ambitions in France. In fact, another campaign a few years later was commissioned, with some historians believing that was actually more dangerous than the one leading up to Tours. But we can't talk about the Battle of Tours and not address the what if history fans out there. What if the Muslims had won the Battle of Tours in 732? Would the Muslim conquest of Western Europe have been inevitable? Would Europe's acceptance of Islam into its society have preceded the modern age migrations we've seen in the last 50 years? If the Muslims had defeated Charles Martel decisively, that's important to stress, then it's safe to assume that they would have had no other serious competitors to contend with in France. Which is major. France is a big part of Western Europe. But personally, I can't see how they could have expanded upon that. The Germanic tribes to the east of France were troublesome to say the least. Their subjugation proved impossible even to the mighty Roman Empire at their height. Even maintaining their rule in France would have been incredibly difficult because of the impending decline of the Umayyads, which was not so much down to the Abbasids who replaced them as it was due to the structural problems within Umayyad governance, many of which were to be highlighted by the incoming Berber revolt in the 740s. So I'm sorry to act like a spoil sport, but on a macro level, the Battle of Tours' importance is likely overblown. For France, It probably holds resonance as it gave birth to a strong central authority in the form of the Carolingian dynasty. But what can we learn from the Battle of Tours? The main thing I take away from it is the value of discipline. The chaotic nature of war naturally makes it the toughest place to exhibit discipline, but it's also the most important arena to display this vital character trait. On an individual level, Charles Martel's soldiers were required to display a reverence to group tactics which would have come at the cost of their own individual survival. On the flip side, the decisive moment in the battle came when some members of the Umayyad forces decided to take matters into their own hands and turned back to their camp, despite not receiving the orders from their superiors. As cruel as it may sound, war is the ultimate arbitrator of truth. That's why it's not surprising numerous CEOs, athletes, and other professionals look to war to learn from it. Because chances are, if something works in war, it probably works in life. Thanks for tuning in. This video is part of Project Clovis, a collaboration with a bunch of other history YouTubers who will be covering some aspect of the Merovingian dynasty of France. I'll leave a link to the entire playlist of videos in the link below. Make sure you check that out. And as usual, a massive thanks to our patrons who continue to support us, especially our newest members, CoreBard and Artin. This is a pretty crazy statistic right here. Most of the people that watch my videos are actually not subscribed to Hikmah History, so please make sure to hit the subscribe button to keep updated with amazing collaborations like this one. Until next time, peace!